Hello, everyone, and welcome to our debate on whether juveniles should be tried as adults on the criminal justice system. My name is Aaliyah, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. My role is to introduce our topic, outline the format, and ensure a fair and balanced conversation between both sides. This debate explores an important and often controversial question in developmental and forensic psychology. At what point should individuals be considered fully responsible for their actions under the law? We'll be examining this issue through developmental, ethical, and social perspectives. Side one will be Brittany and Keegan arguing that juveniles who commit serious crimes should be tried as adults, emphasizing personal accountability, justice for victims, and public safety. Side two will be Sarah and Bailey arguing that juveniles should not be tried as adults, highlighting research on brain development, rehabilitation, and social equity. Each side will present their main arguments supported by research, respond to the opposing side's points, and end with a closing statement. After each side finishes, we'll open with a brief discussion as well. As you listen, I encourage you to think about the developmental science, moral reasoning, and social justice and how all these intersect within the issue and what that means for how society defines fairness and responsibility. Let's begin with side one presenting their opening argument.
So, our argument is that adolescence is sufficient for adult sentencing. By this age, teens understand right from wrong and can anticipate the consequences of their choices. Serious crimes committed at 16 endanger public safety just as much as those committed by adults, and accountability to victims requires that the punishment match the severity of the offense regardless of the offender's age. Our first argument centers around cognitive maturity. At age 16, individuals have the cognitive maturity to be sentenced as adults. Piaget would state that these individuals are in the formal operational stage. During this stage, you're able to think logically about situations, plan for hypotheticals, and anticipate consequences. This is when sophisticated thinking really starts to take place. Our textbook would agree, as it states that around ages 14 to 16, there's an advancement in moral thinking. Peer reviewed research would also support Piaget's framework. Brain scans have shown that the area responsible for executive functioning starts rapidly developing from ages 10 to 15, then stabilizes on average by ages 18 to 20. By the age of 16, individuals have already hit their growth spurt when it comes to developing executive thinking. The majority of it's done. The areas necessary for understanding right from wrong and anticipating consequences are already formed. More so, it's been proven that adolescents are capable of making executive decisions on an adult level when given the time to deliberate. In the event of premeditated crimes, there's no reason that juveniles shouldn't be charged as adults.
Going more into the cognitive maturity, our textbooks discuss how the final growth spurt in the brain's gray matter occurs between ages 11 through 12. That's the frontal lobes of the brain, which guide planning, problem solving, and judgment. Around ages 11 through 12, adolescents begin to understand abstract propositions and they try to reason logically about them. This is often referred to as the hypothetical deductive reasoning process, which uses essentially hypothesis. To solve problems, it follows a planned manner to test and evaluate the hypothesis until the best solution is reached. An adolescent begins to ponder the nature of their own thinking, and they can think about why they were thinking about whatever it is they were thinking, which is idealism, and the thoughts about the future responsibilities. So they're kind of starting to weigh those pros and cons and have that awareness of those consequences.
Our second big argument focuses on public safety and accountability. One of the most important jobs of the judicial system is to keep the public safe and hold offenders accountable. Juvenile delinquency is a significant problem, and these offenders need to be held accountable despite their age. Although the system was created in 1899, things have changed significantly since then. Per the National Criminal Justice Association, in the years between 1960 and 2022, the number of cases in the juvenile system grew by 36%. These aren't just small crimes either. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the number of homicides being committed by juveniles increased from 886 to 1,352 between 2016 and 2020. This is around a 50% increase. Despite their age, juveniles are a danger to public safety. It's important to hold them accountable and keep them separate from the public.
Going along with public safety and the accountability, an article that was titled Adolescent Decision Making: A Decade in Review states that between the ages of 15 through 16, Youth have required cognitive capabilities to rationally and thoughtfully deliberate in ways that were the same as adults in decision making. The legal reasoning among 13 to 17-year-olds were not different from anyone aged between 18 to 24. That shows consideration of long term consequences like diminished job prospects associated with a criminal conviction. Looking at it this way, juveniles are capable of taking accountability, and it helps ensure public safety. If a juvenile is incarcerated, they can't be out in the community, potentially repeating behavior. Learning skills can take time, and it can take a while to get rehabilitation programs started while already being integrated into the community. With our third point, we talk about justice for victims. In an article titled Listening to Victims, it talks about how restorative justice or rehabilitation can promote unreasonable goals. While restorative justice appears to go hand in hand with expectations for reduced offender penalties, victims feel that the restorative justice is a way out for offenders whose primary motivation might be to avoid responsibilities or pain. It's often an expectation through these programs that offenders will offer genuine apologies for what they've done, but sometimes offenders are not sorry for what they've done, and the victims may feel harmed again for the failure of justice. These programs also kind of put an unrealistic like hope on like victims. It's still allowing them to not heal. They're still facing the offender, and it can cause more damaging stress. And it kind of puts a pressure on the victim to be a part of the offender's like rehabilitation process, and that's just not fair to them.
Thank you to side one for sharing your position and supporting evidence. Now we'll move to side two, who will offer an alternative viewpoint on the issue.
So, for our first point, it is important to consider the developmental processes of adolescents when considering whether or not juveniles should be tried as adults. So, research from Dr. Yu in 2020 on adolescent brain development shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for decision making, impulse control, and moral reasoning, is not fully developed until around the age of 25. However, the limbic system, which is responsible for survival behaviors such as aggression and defense, emotional processing, and basic motivations, is mature in adolescence. This can lead to more emotionally based decisions and actions. Research also supports that adolescents can often make these emotionally and basic drive motivated decisions due to their psychological development, despite the fact that they may report that they know what they did was wrong when being charged for the crime. This can mean that juveniles are cognitively less capable than adults of foreseeing the consequences of their actions at the time of committing the crime, as well as less capable of resisting peer pressure and making irrational and less capable of making rational decisions. Given this, treating juveniles as if they have the same mental and emotional maturity as adults may not fully take into consideration adolescent cognitive development and can be considered legally irresponsible.
So Bailey pointed out and it explained the cognitive maturity side of it. And I think it's also important to consider the adolescent behavior is shaped by forces outside of a young person's control. And that includes family instability, poverty, trauma, and biological predispositions towards impulsivity, according to the textbook. Juvenile delinquency often emerges from these conditions, not fully formed criminal intent. Treating juveniles as adults ignores critical developmental differences. 15 or 16-year-olds, they don't have the same moral reasoning, impulse control, or long-term judgment as adults. Adult prosecution abandons rehabilitation and increases cycles of trauma and recidivism. The question is not whether juveniles should be held accountable. They should. But the question is how. Evidence shows that rehabilitation in the juvenile system is more effective, humane, and just than punitive adult sentencing.
For our second point, trying juveniles as adults doesn't necessarily make society safer. In fact, it often does the opposite by increasing the likelihood of recidivism. Research consistently shows that juveniles tried as adults are more likely to reoffend. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, placing youth in adult prisons increases their risk of recidivism and also exposes them to environments where they are more likely to adopt criminal behaviors from adults who may have committed more serious crimes. Also, our textbook mentions research from Moffitt and colleagues in 2006, which distinguishes between a life course persistent offender and adolescent limited offenders. Most juvenile offenders fall in the second category of adolescent limited, where they typically age out of criminal behavior as their brain matures. So, incarcerating these juveniles in long-term adult sentences not only fails to address their unique needs, but also severely punishes them for behaviors they are likely to grow out of.
So, to build on what Bailey just said, the juvenile justice system is not about letting kids off the hook. It is about interventions proven to change behavior and improve public safety. So, research identifies six main approaches: restitution and community service, family intervention, token economies, wilderness training, social skills training, and fear-based deterrence. Family intervention and social skills training are the most effective at reducing recidivism. Family programs address the root causes of delinquency by improving communication, resolving conflict within the home, and strengthening that parental support. Social skills training equips youth to manage anger, resist that peer pressure, and build those positive relationships, holding youth accountable while promoting that growth and stability. So, when juveniles are tried as adults, they lose access to these supports and enter environments that increase rather than reduce criminal behavior. Adult incarceration reinforces criminal identity and raises the likelihood of reoffending. Conditions in detention are often traumatizing. According to the Juvenile Law Center, youth frequently endure solitary confinement, shackling, strip searches, and chemical sprays, causing anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Adult facilities amplify these harms. Youth are isolated from family, surrounded by older offenders, and forced to adopt these survival behaviors like aggression and mistrust. And that undermines the very skills rehabilitation aims to build. So, if public safety is the goal, rehabilitation must take priority over retribution. Evidence-based juvenile programs reduce crime and restore lives, while adult incarceration leaves youth more traumatized, alienated, and likely to reoffend.
So, for our third point, we must consider the racial and socioeconomic bias in the criminal justice system when trying juveniles as adults. Data from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers shows that Black and Latino youth are disproportionately tried as adults, despite committing crimes at similar rates to their white peers. Espinoza and colleagues in 2011 found that racial stereotypes often influenced judicial decisions, resulting in systemic overrepresentation of marginalized youth in adult courts. Trying juveniles as adults amplifies existing inequalities and undermines the principle of equal justice under the law. So we need to be mindful of the racial and socioeconomic bias that can be perpetuated by laws that make sentencing juveniles as adults common practice.
So some might argue that trying juveniles as adults ensures equal treatment, but in practice, this is far from true. Minority youth, especially Black and Latino adolescents, are disproportionately tried as adults and receive harsher sentences than white peers for similar offenses, according to the Juvenile Law Center. Black youth are also more likely to be perceived as older and more dangerous than their white peers, leading to harsher treatment at every stage of the justice process. So, equal treatment in a racially biased system does not produce fairness, it amplifies existing inequalities. Youth transferred to adult courts face longer sentences, fewer rehabilitative opportunities, and have lasting consequences, including limited access to education, employment, and housing. This reinforces cycles of poverty and incarceration in marginalized communities. A truly just system must address these disparities. Equity requires access to evidence-based rehabilitation, not adult sentencing that accelerates inequality. Prioritizing fair, supportive interventions reduces recidivism, promotes public safety, and breaks the generational cycle of systemic bias.
Thank you to both sides for presenting your main argument. Now we'll move to the rebuttal portion of the debate, where one team will respond to points made by the other and clarify their position.
Although the other side has shown research that states that the brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25, this fact doesn't matter when it comes to sentencing. As previously stated, research supports that adolescents are capable of making adult level decisions, especially in the event of premeditated crimes. In addition, brain development or biological differences aren't taken into account for other populations. There is no reason juveniles should be given special consideration. Those with antisocial personality disorder have reduced gray matter in their brains. Those with mental illnesses are able to stand trial as long as they can tell right from wrong. These factors can contribute to their crimes, but all are treated as sane adults. Even if the brain is still developing until the age of 25, research has shown that the brain reverts back to the way it was during adolescence around the age of 70. 70-year-olds are completely capable of making decisions and being charged as adults, so 16-year-olds should be too. They're at similar points in brain development and should go through the exact same system.
While I understand your concern with it possibly being a double standard when considering other types of offenders who are adults, we should consider that juveniles have a greater capacity for rehabilitation and change in this instance. So teens are more adaptable and responsive to treatment or interventions than adults. Um, Harsh adult sentences often fail to address the root causes of their behavior and can limit opportunities for reform, while juvenile focus programs can help them change paths. It's also important to note what I mentioned earlier about how adolescents can recognize that what they did was wrong after the fact of committing the crime. However, in the moment of the offense, one could argue that adolescents are being more influenced by their mature limbic system as opposed to their less developed logical decision making in their prefrontal cortex. While this does not cover every instance of juvenile delinquency, it can apply to most instances.
Going back into something that Sarah said about community resources and the rehabilitation programs. Those don't necessarily always guarantee improvements, and juveniles are still in the community at that point, potentially having access to victims, affecting how the victim may feel or doing further damage. Also, there are rehabilitation programs that juveniles can take while being incarcerated to help promote reoffending.
So, protecting victims is important, but trying youth as adults does not achieve it. In all 51 U.S. jurisdictions, the juvenile system already factors in public safety and victim concerns in every detention decision. And that's coming from the Juvenile Center for Juvenile or the National Center for Juvenile Justice. So, sending adolescents to adult prisons, however, exposes them to trauma and violence and hardened offenders, making them more likely to reoffend, not less. So the real protection comes from evidence-based rehabilitation, holding youth accountable, teaching them skills, and addressing the root causes of their behavior. And adult sentencing may seem tough, but it fails victims in the long run by increasing that recidivism and leaving unsafe patterns unbroken.
Thank you to both sides for presenting such thoughtful and well-supported arguments on this important topic. Today's de I'm so sorry. Today's debate highlighted the complexity of deciding whether juveniles should be treated as adults, an issue that lies at the intersection of psychology, ethics, and justice. Both perspectives offered valuable insights into how society defines accountability while also considering the developmental needs of youth. By continuing these conversations, we'll move closer to a justice system that is both fair and informed by research. Thank you all for listening and engaging in this meaningful discussion.